The call came on a Tuesday, a day that was supposed to be defined by quarterly reports and the drone of office air conditioning. My father's voice, usually a warm and steady baritone that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, was thin and frayed, like a rope stretched to its breaking point. "Alex," he started, and the single word carried so much weight it felt like a physical object traveling through the phone. "He's really going to do it. Thorne is bringing the machines." I stood there, staring out of my 17th floor office window, watching a silent, indifferent city crawl below. The world of corporate finance, of asset management and leveraged buyouts, evaporated in an instant, replaced by the scent of freshly turned earth and the memory of my father's hands, calloused and kind, teaching me how to plant tomatoes in our small town's community garden. That garden wasn't just a plot of land. For Harmony Creek, it was a living monument. For my father, Arthur Mercer, it was his life's work after retiring from teaching history at the local high school for 40 years. It was a half-acre of town property he'd been allowed to cultivate by a handshake agreement with the mayor 3 decades ago. It had become the town's heart, a place where kids learned about nature, where lonely seniors found companionship, and where the best heirloom tomatoes in the county were grown. And now, Councilman Marcus Thorne wanted to pave it over for a luxury condominium complex. Thorne was a man who moved through our small town like he owned it, a third-generation inheritor of the town's largest construction firm, a peacock with a sledgehammer who saw tradition not as a foundation, but as an obstacle. I told my boss I needed to take emergency family leave, my voice a flat line of controlled urgency. The 3-hour drive from the city to Harmony Creek was a blur of highway hypnosis and simmering rage. I found my father exactly where I knew he'd be, standing at the edge of the garden, his back ramrod straight, a frail but defiant scarecrow against the looming yellow thread of a bulldozer parked just beyond the picket fence he'd built himself. Marcus Thorne was there, leaning against the grill of his oversized pickup truck, arms crossed over a polo shirt that was too tight for his frame. He wore a smirk that was as much a part of his uniform as his expensive leather boots. Beside him stood a sheriff's deputy, a young man named Miller who looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on anything but my father. "Arthur," Thorne was saying, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "I've tried to be reasonable. This is progress. You can't stand in the way of progress over a few tomato plants." My father's hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "This is more than tomato plants, Marcus, and you know it. This is our town's soul. It's a place for everyone, not just for the wealthy friends you want to sell condos to." Thorne laughed, a short, barking sound that held no humor. "The town's soul doesn't pay property taxes, old man. This development will. End of story." He finally noticed me as I walked up and stood beside my dad. His eyes swept over me, taking in my city clothes, my softer hands, my lack of a small-town pedigree. He saw a nuisance, not a threat. "Well, look at this," he sneered. "The big-shot son comes down from his ivory tower. Come to hold your daddy's hand while he watches his little hobby get turned into a parking garage." My father put a restraining hand on my arm, but I didn't need it. The anger inside me had cooled, crystallizing into something sharp and focused. I've spent my entire career in rooms with men like Marcus Thorne. Men whose arrogance was a shield for their mediocrity, whose power was derived not from merit but from privilege and the willingness to crush anyone smaller than them. They all had the same tells. The way his eyes refused to hold a steady gaze, the slight tremor in his jaw when challenged, the over-enunciated words meant to project an authority he didn't truly feel. He was a bully, but more than that, he was sloppy. And sloppy people leave trails. "My father asked you a question, Councilman," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the still air. "What happens to the people who rely on this garden? The food bank donations, the seniors program?" Thorne's smirk widened. "Not my problem. They can go to the supermarket like everyone else." He pushed himself off the truck and took a step forward, using his physical presence to intimidate. "Look, kid. I don't know who you think you are, but this is a done deal. The town council approved the zoning change last month. We have the permits. This land is being redeveloped. You have 48 hours to remove any personal effects. After that, he gestured to the bulldozer, my crew starts clearing the lot. Any interference will be considered trespassing, and I'll have Deputy Miller here personally escort you to a holding cell. He looked from me to my father, his gaze lingering on the older man's tired face, enjoying the victory. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that his threat wasn't just a challenge. It was a professional courtesy. He had just officially declared war on a man whose entire life was dedicated to dismantling men exactly like him, brick by corrupt brick. He just didn't know it yet. He saw a son. He should have seen a federal auditor. I got my father home, the scent of defeat clinging to his old wool jacket. He sank into his favorite armchair, the one worn smooth by decades of reading, and looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The house, usually a sanctuary of quiet intellectualism filled with towering stacks of history books and the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock, now felt like a besieged fortress. "What are we going to do, son?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "He owns the council. He owns the sheriff. We can't fight him." I poured him a glass of water, my hand steady. "You're right," I said, and his shoulders slumped further. "We can't fight him. Not his way." I paused, letting the words hang in the air before continuing. "So we'll fight him my way." For the first time that day, a flicker of his old, curious teacher's spirit returned to his eyes. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. I just opened my laptop on the dining room table, the sleek, black, government-issue machine looking alien amongst the scattered newspapers and half-finished crossword puzzles. The familiar encryption sequence booted up, and in the quiet hum of the hard drive, the concerned son receded, and the forensic investigator took his place. My battlefield wasn't a half-acre of soil, it was data. My weapons weren't defiance and picket signs, they were subpoenas and spreadsheets. Thorne had made a critical error in judgment. He assumed the fight would be on his turf. I started with the public records, the low-hanging fruit. The Harmony Creek Town website was archaic, but the information was there if you knew where to dig. Council meeting minutes, municipal budgets, zoning commission reports. It was all a chaotic mess of poorly scanned PDFs and unsearchable documents, designed to be transparent in theory but opaque in practice. It was a classic small-town shell game. I focused on the garden property. The zoning variance to reclassify it from public utility to commercial development had been pushed through in a single session, rushed onto the agenda at the last minute. The vote was 3-2. The deciding vote was cast by a councilman named Gary Henderson, a man who, according to public records, had voted in lockstep with Thorne on every major issue for the past 5 years. Red flag number 1. The developer awarded the contract was a company called Creekview Estates LLC. A quick search of the state's business registry showed it was incorporated only 6 months prior. The registered agent was a law firm known for creating anonymous shell corporations. Red flag number 2. It didn't take a genius to connect the LLC back to Thorne's family firm, but the layers of legal obfuscation were designed to give him plausible deniability. It was amateurish, but in a town with no real oversight, amateurish was good enough. The next morning, I went to the Harmony Diner, the town's unofficial intelligence agency. Over a cup of burnt coffee, I listened to the hushed conversations, the symphony of local gossip and grievance. The name Thorne was a recurring theme, spoken with a mixture of fear and resentment. I saw a woman sitting alone in a corner booth, staring into her cup as if it held the secrets of the universe. I recognized her from years ago. Elena Garcia. She and her husband had run The Rolling Pin, a bakery that had been a town institution. My father had mentioned they'd been forced to close a few years back. I walked over, introducing myself as Arthur's son. Her weary eyes softened with recognition. "Your father is a good man," she said quietly. "What that animal is doing to him is a crime." I sat down, and over the next hour, her story tumbled out. Thorne had wanted her property for a national fast food chain, a deal that would net him a hefty consulting fee. When she refused to sell, he'd waged a campaign of bureaucratic warfare. A sudden tax reassessment that tripled her bill. A newly discovered zoning violation for her bakery sign, which had been there for 20 years. Endless, costly inspections from the health department, run by Thorne's cousin. Her husband had a heart attack from the stress. She'd been forced to sell to Thorne for less than half the property's value. He bled us dry, she whispered, her hands trembling. And Henderson just rubber-stamped every single motion. They worked together. Everyone knows it, but no one can prove it. She had given me the human cost, the emotional texture of Thorne's corruption. And she'd confirmed Henderson was the key. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. It was my father, his voice once again tight with panic. Deputy Miller was at the door. He'd just been served. I raced home to find my father holding two documents. The first was a lawsuit for defamation and libel, claiming my father's public statements had damaged Thorne's reputation. It was a frivolous, transparent slap suit designed to intimidate and drain his resources. The second was a notice of an impending lien on our house for $10,000 in fabricated, unpaid land use fees for the garden, dating back 5 years. Thorne wasn't just taking the garden anymore. He was coming for our home. He was trying to break my father's spirit, to bury him under the weight of legal paper until he suffocated. I felt a cold, clean rage settle over me. This changed the timeline. This made it personal. I spent the next 8 hours back on my laptop, fueled by black coffee and righteous fury. I cross-referenced every payment the town had made to outside vendors for the last 3 years against Henderson's financial disclosure forms. It was a needle in a digital haystack. And then, at 2 a.m, I found it. A company called Green Pastures Landscaping. They had a recurring monthly contract for municipal grounds beautification. The payments were substantial, totaling over $80,000 a year. But I knew for a fact the town's own public works department handled all the groundskeeping. I ran the LLC through the federal database, a system far more powerful than the state registry. The company was registered to a P.O. box. But the tax identification number was linked to a single name, Carol Henderson. The councilman's wife. It was a ghost company. A pipeline for siphoning taxpayer money directly into the pocket of the man who cast the deciding vote. Thorne wasn't just a bully. He was a thief. And he'd just handed me the thread that would unravel his entire world. The discovery of the ghost company changed everything. This was no longer a personal vendetta or a civic dispute, it was a federal crime. Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the public. The list was long and damning. My father was worried about a $10,000 lien, I was now looking at a multi-year conspiracy that could send multiple people to prison. It was time to stop being a son and start being an officer of the court. I walked into the quiet of my childhood bedroom, the sports trophies on the shelf gathering dust like relics from another life, and made the call. It was to a secure line in Washington, D.C., one that bypassed switchboards and secretaries. It went straight to the desk of Deputy Director Evelyn Reed, the head of the Public Integrity Section and a woman whose mind was as sharp and unforgiving as a surgeon's scalpel. "Mercer," she answered, her voice devoid of pleasantries. "This is an unscheduled call. Report." I laid it out for her in the clipped, precise language of our profession. I didn't mention my father or the garden. I spoke of municipal corruption, a compromised town councilman, and a clear pattern of embezzlement linked to a public works contract. I detailed the shell corporation, the registered agent, and the clear conflict of interest. I ended by stating my belief that it was a predicate for a larger racketeering scheme. There was silence on the line for a long moment. I could picture her staring at a map on her wall, a map dotted with pins representing the hundreds of similar cases of rot and decay we investigated across the country. "You're on personal leave, Alex," she finally said. "I am," I confirmed. "But I am also a resident of this town," and I'm witnessing an ongoing criminal enterprise. Another pause. What do you need? She asked. Provisional authority to open a preliminary inquiry. Access to the network. And a financial forensics team on standby. She didn't hesitate. Granted. Your credentials will be active within the hour. Keep this off official servers until you have something concrete. Operate under discretionary protocol. And Mercer? Ma'am. Don't get yourself shot. The line went dead. The game had changed. I was no longer just a man with a laptop. I was a ghost, a federal agent with the full, invisible weight of the Department of Justice at my back. With my credentials active, the digital doors flew open. I spent the next 36 hours building the case, the world outside my father's house fading into an irrelevant hum. I drafted and filed sealed subpoenas for the bank records of Gary and Carol Henderson, Green Pastures LLC, and, for good measure, Marcus Thorne himself. I requested cell phone records and email communications between Thorne, Henderson, and the law firm that had set up the developer's shell company. The requests were routed through a DC server, masked and anonymous, appearing to the banks and telecom companies as just another part of the vast, churning machinery of federal law enforcement. They would comply without question. Thorne was living in a world of handshakes and backroom deals. He had no idea that his entire financial life was about to be laid bare by a silent, digital request he would never see coming. While I worked, Thorne's hubris reached its zenith. Believing he had already won, he gave an interview to the local county newspaper, a puff piece designed to frame him as the town's forward-thinking savior. There was a picture of him standing in front of the community garden, arms spread wide, a grotesque parody of a benevolent creator. He called the development the Thorne Gateway, a monument to a new era of prosperity for Harmony Creek. The article was filled with his self-serving quotes, but it was the last paragraph that made my blood run cold with fury. Of course, there will always be those who resist change, he was quoted as saying, sentimentalists like old Arthur Mercer who would rather see the town stagnate than thrive. His son, some kind of city banker, I believe, came down to make a fuss, but he's gone quiet. I imagine he's realized you can't fight progress. Some people just don't have the stomach for a real fight. The condescension was staggering. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance. He was dancing on a landmine and calling it a victory parade. He had no idea the ground beneath his feet was already crumbling. The first set of bank records arrived in my encrypted inbox just after midnight. It was exactly as I'd suspected, only worse. The town's monthly payments to Green Pastures Landscaping were deposited into a business account. From there, the money was immediately transferred to a personal joint account belonging to Gary and Carol Henderson. They were making small, regular cash withdrawals, likely for personal expenses, but the bulk of the money sat there, accumulating. Then I found the real transaction. A week after the town council vote that approved Thorne's zoning variance, there was a single wire transfer of $50,000 from the Hendersons' joint account to a numbered holding company. The name was generic, meaningless. But a holding company has to be registered somewhere. A few more queries through the federal database, and I had it. The holding company was a subsidiary of a larger private equity firm. And the sole director of that firm? Marcus Thorne. It was the smoking gun. A direct quid pro quo. Henderson had sold his vote for $50,000, laundered through a fake landscaping business. Thorne hadn't just bribed a public official, he'd paid for him with the town's own money. It was a perfectly closed loop of corruption. I leaned back in my chair, the chain of evidence now a complete, unbreakable circle. And as if to deliver the final piece of the puzzle himself, an email alert popped up on my screen. It was a notification from the town's website. Thorne had scheduled an emergency town hall meeting for the following evening. The agenda item was singular, a final public vote to authorize the sale of the garden property to Creekview Estates LLC. It was meant to be his coronation. A public spectacle to rubber stamp his victory and humiliate my father one last time. He had just handed me the perfect stage. He thought he was closing a deal. In reality, he had just set the date for his own execution. The Harmony Creek Town Hall was a stuffy, wood-paneled room built for sleepy bureaucratic proceedings, not for battle. But tonight, the air was thick with a tension that felt electric. The room was divided down the middle as if by an invisible wall. On one side sat Thorne's allies, business owners who stood to profit from his schemes, council members in his pocket, and sycophants who fed on his power. They whispered amongst themselves, smug and self-assured. On the other side sat the heart of the town, my father's former students, seniors who found solace in the garden, young families who believed in community. They looked anxious, their faces etched with a weary resignation, as if they had come to bear witness to a foregone conclusion. My father and I sat in the front row of that second group. He was dressed in his old tweed jacket, a silent statement of his dignity. I was in a simple dark suit, an anonymous man in a crowd. My father reached over and squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens, Alex, I'm proud of you for standing with me." I squeezed back. "It's not over yet, Dad." Thorne entered the room like a conquering hero, all smiles and backpats for his supporters. He took his seat at the head of the council table, basking in the attention. The meeting began with a series of dull formalities, each one a turn of the screw, tightening the knot of dread in the room. Finally, Thorne cleared his throat and addressed the main agenda item. The first set of bank records arrived in my encrypted inbox just after midnight. It was exactly as I'd suspected, only worse. The town's monthly payments to Green Pastures Landscaping were deposited into a business account. From there, the money was immediately transferred to a personal joint account belonging to Gary and Carol Henderson. They were making small, regular cash withdrawals, likely for personal expenses, but the bulk of the money sat there, accumulating. Then I found the real transaction. A week after the town council vote that approved Thorne's zoning variance, there was a single wire transfer of $50,000 from the Hendersons' joint account to a numbered holding company. The name was generic, meaningless. But a holding company has to be registered somewhere. A few more queries through the federal database, and I had it. The holding company was a subsidiary of a larger private equity firm. And the sole director of that firm? Marcus Thorne. It was the smoking gun. A direct quid pro quo. Henderson had sold his vote for $50,000, laundered through a fake landscaping business. Thorne hadn't just bribed a public official, he'd paid for him with the town's own money. It was a perfectly closed loop of corruption. I leaned back in my chair, the chain of evidence now a complete, unbreakable circle. And as if to deliver the final piece of the puzzle himself, an email alert popped up on my screen. It was a notification from the town's website. Thorne had scheduled an emergency town hall meeting for the following evening. The agenda item was singular, a final public vote to authorize the sale of the garden property to Creekview Estates LLC. It was meant to be his coronation. A public spectacle to rubber stamp his victory and humiliate my father one last time. He had just handed me the perfect stage. He thought he was closing a deal. In reality, he had just set the date for his own execution. The Harmony Creek Town Hall was a stuffy, wood-paneled room built for sleepy bureaucratic proceedings, not for battle. But tonight, the air was thick with a tension that felt electric. The room was divided down the middle as if by an invisible wall. On one side sat Thorne's allies, business owners who stood to profit from his schemes, council members in his pocket, and sycophants who fed on his power. They whispered amongst themselves, smug and self-assured. On the other side sat the heart of the town, my father's former students, seniors who found solace in the garden, young families who believed in community. They looked anxious, their faces etched with a weary resignation, as if they had come to bear witness to a foregone conclusion. My father and I sat in the front row of that second group. He was dressed in his old tweed jacket, a silent statement of his dignity. I was in a simple dark suit, an anonymous man in a crowd. My father reached over and squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens, Alex, I'm proud of you for standing with me." I squeezed back. It's not over yet, Dad. Thorne entered the room like a conquering hero, all smiles and backpats for his supporters. He took his seat at the head of the council table, basking in the attention. The meeting began with a series of dull formalities, each one a turn of the screw, tightening the knot of dread in the room. Finally, Thorne cleared his throat and addressed the main agenda item. He stood and walked to the podium, a practiced performance of a benevolent leader. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice oozing false sincerity. "Tonight, we stand at a crossroads. A choice between the past and the future. A choice between stagnation and prosperity." He spoke for 10 minutes, weaving a tapestry of lies about job creation, economic growth, and a brighter future for Harmony Creek, all thanks to his Gateway project. He painted the opposition, my father, as a well-meaning but hopelessly sentimental relic, a man who couldn't see the bigger picture. "We all cherish our memories," Thorne said, looking directly at my father with an expression of profound pity. "But we cannot let nostalgia mortgage our children's future. It is a hard decision, but leadership is about making hard decisions." He returned to the table, his face flushed with self-importance. "I believe the matter has been sufficiently discussed. I now call for a final vote on the motion to authorize the sale of Parcel 7B to Creekview Estates LLC. He looked at Henderson, who was already nodding, ready to play his part. The air in the room grew heavy. This was it. The final nail. But just as the chairman began the roll call, I stood up. My movement was calm, unhurried, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "A point of information, Mr. Chairman," I said, my voice even and clear. Every head in the room swiveled toward me. Thorne's eyes narrowed, his mask of benevolence falling away to reveal raw annoyance. "The public comment period is over," he snapped. "Sit down, sir. The council is voting." I ignored him and took a step into the center aisle. "I believe there is information relevant to this vote that the council and the public have a right to hear." Thorne's face darkened with rage. He was losing control of his own coronation. "Sit down, son," he boomed, his voice echoing in the silent room. "The adults are handling this." That was my cue. I walked forward slowly, purposefully, not to the public comment microphone, but directly to the podium he had just vacated. I placed my hands on its sides and looked out at the sea of confused and startled faces. Thorne was half out of his seat, ready to have me physically removed. "My name," I began, my voice amplified by the microphone, resonant and cold, "is Alexander Mercer." I paused, letting my name hang in the air, a name they knew only as Arthur's son. Then I delivered the payload. "I am a senior forensic investigator with the Public Integrity Section of the United States Department of Justice." Dead silence. The kind of absolute, profound silence that feels like the air has been sucked from the room. Thorne froze, his mouth half open, the blood draining from his face. Councilman Henderson looked like he'd been struck by lightning. I saw the exact moment the truth landed, the moment they realized this wasn't about a garden anymore. I had their complete, undivided attention. For the past 72 hours, I continued in the same measured, emotionless tone. At the direction of the Department of Justice, I have been conducting a preliminary inquiry into public corruption here in Harmony Creek. Specifically, into the matter of this vote. I picked up a thin file I had placed on the podium. "I'd like to draw the council's attention to a company called Green Pastures Landscaping LLC, which has received over $80,000 from the town's budget this year for services that were never rendered. This shell company is registered to Carol Henderson, the wife of Councilman Henderson." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Henderson looked like he was about to vomit. "Our investigation shows that these taxpayer funds were then funneled into the Hendersons' private account. More interestingly, 1 week after Councilman Henderson cast the deciding vote to rezone the garden property, a payment of $50,000 was wired from his account to a holding company. That holding company, Mr. Thorne, is owned by you." I looked directly at Thorne, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure panic. "That is not a land deal, Councilman. That is a bribe. It is wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. It is a federal racketeering charge that carries a sentence of 20 years in prison. Thorne slammed his hand on the table, finding his voice at last. This is insane. It's slander. Deputy Miller, arrest this man. But Deputy Miller wasn't moving. He was staring, pale as a ghost, at the main doors at the back of the hall. I followed his gaze. Standing there, silent and imposing, were two people in simple, dark suits. They were my colleagues from the bureau. One of them met my eyes and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was sprung. I turned back to the podium, to the shattered man at the council table. As there is now an active federal investigation into the members of this council, I said, my voice ringing with finality, this vote is void. This meeting is over. The silence in the room broke, not with a bang, but with the quiet, deliberate footsteps of the two FBI agents walking down the center aisle. All of Thorne's blustering rage evaporated, replaced by the primal, wide-eyed terror of a trapped animal. He looked from the agents to me and back again, his mind finally comprehending the totality of his miscalculation. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. One of the agents, a calm woman with prematurely gray hair, simply said, Marcus Thorne, you need to come with us. There was no resistance. The fight had drained out of him, leaving a hollow shell. They placed him in handcuffs with a quiet professionalism that was somehow more damning than any shouting match could have been. Henderson simply slumped in his chair, covering his face with his hands, while his wife sobbed in the audience. Deputy Miller was met at the door by another agent and quietly escorted out, his career and his complicity ending in a single, silent walk to a federal vehicle. For a moment, the entire town just watched, stunned. Then, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. It was Elena Garcia, the baker Thorne had ruined. Another joined her, and then another, until the side of the room that had been filled with fear erupted in a wave of thunderous, cathartic applause. My father stood and hugged me, his shoulders shaking with a relief so profound it felt like a physical force. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of Thorne's corruption was laid bare by a federal task force. The indictments came down like rain. Thorne, Henderson, the developer, and even the sheriff were charged in a sweeping 30-count indictment for racketeering. The money they had siphoned from the town was seized, and the crooked deals they'd made were unwound. An interim government was appointed by the state to clean house, and for the first time in a generation, a wave of real transparency and hope swept through Harmony Creek. The Thorne Gateway project died before a single shovelful of dirt could be moved. A month later, I stood with my father in the garden. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the old oak tree, and the air was sweet with the smell of basil and warm earth. A new, beautifully carved wooden sign stood at the entrance. It read, Arthur Mercer Community Park. My father, looking 10 years younger, was showing a small girl how to properly water a sunflower sprout, his voice filled with the old, patient warmth of the teacher he had always been. He looked over at me and smiled, a genuine, soul-deep smile I hadn't seen in years. I had come home thinking I was just helping my dad save his garden. But standing there, watching my father's legacy protected and a town's soul reclaimed, I realized the truth. Men like Thorne feed on silence and fear. Their power isn't in their wealth or their position, it's in the belief that they are untouchable. My job wasn't just about spreadsheets and bank records. It was about reminding men like him, and the towns they terrorize, that nobody is above the law. Justice doesn't always come loudly, but when it's built on a foundation of undeniable truth, it is absolute.